and certainly in my generation, the era I grew up in, conceiving of a socialist society was just sort of, there was no there was no discussion of it. There was no visions of it. I'm technically Gen X, at the tail end, or the front end, I guess. But the point being that there just wasn't a lot. It really did feel like a lack of imagination. Is that still the case, do you think, or no?
I think it's mostly political will. I think, especially because the book isn't saying, okay, this whole government is going to be socialist overnight. And if you look at the readings of socialist activists and philosophers and government officials, they were still trying to figure out what that looks like. So I think it would take a lot of imagining and conversation and practice to figure out what that could look like, especially in a world where we know socialists are maligned and killed, and there have been coups against socialist governments. So putting that aside, that yes, there will take some imagination, I think, to get into the specifics, there are a lot of basic things that socialists have lobbied for that have been around for about a century. Universal healthcare, single payer healthcare is not a new topic. This is something that came up in the early 1900s under the Truman administration. And even then, you had business interests who lobbied together to say, this is going to affect our bottom line. You had the insurance companies who realized that this could be something that should go into the private sector instead of being a public sector issue. So things like that, thinking about free college tuition, that's not new. We had it in so many states, but then state governments, like with healthcare, they realized that, we're starting to integrate. So we need to figure out a way to privatize so that we are not, so that we can keep these goods, we can keep this common good for certain amounts of people. And those people tended to be white. So people didn't want to share with Black people. And so that's how we ended up retracting from a lot of these public services. Something that I argue in the book is that having the government do things is not socialist in and of itself. It's maybe arguably not socialist at all, because you see it in capitalist countries, but socialists have been the ones at the forefront of those movements. And we can at least get back to having some basic necessities.
I think it's also just about removing points of leverage from capitalists and from people in the private sector. Like when you mentioned their education, the privatization of that, the privatization of our healthcare, those are all things that, when they're decommodified, people are able to kind of live their lives more in the way that they want to, as opposed to if you lose your job, your healthcare is gone. Or, if you don't like your job, well, you have to pay back your student loans because you're so deeply in debt. You're going to stay in this position. And I think that's what makes it so difficult to disentangle. Because the powerful really want to keep those leverage points.
You're absolutely right, Emma. And even this idea of having, an American dream through home ownership, that means you have to stay sedentary. Can people really go on strike if they have to pay a mortgage? People may not mind being evicted in a place where, they might have a 6-month or 1-year lease, but you have a mortgage. You're tied to these people until it's paid off or you sell it. So how committed are we going to be even to movement work if we're so bogged down with these paying for things that are necessary for our survival? So that's absolutely, correct. And this is why we have big corporations who fight so hard against it. Even though it is not like an orthodox socialism, it's taking so many of our goods out of the private sector, out of the financialization sector. So they're having a fit. And so I think, it's something that it's important to recognize.
I think that's the same dynamic too with healthcare. Even on a bottom financial level, removing that obligation from employers would be helpful in terms of like just the sheer sort of financial transaction involved, but it would also cede a lot of control over workers that they don't want to necessarily cede. Let's talk about the relationship between capitalism and race. You talk about the Black radical tradition in the book. How does that interplay work?
I think it's crucial. I think it's so important that I had it in this second chapter, and it's something that we debated, my editor and I, we went back and forth with, just to give people a little background, the first chapter is on capitalism, just the basics of what it looks like, who are capitalists. The second chapter is on race and class through clever references and memes and things like that. And then the third chapter is also kind of an introductory chapter, just looking at what does it mean to be socialist? What has socialism looked like? What are socialist projects kind of around the world? What have they looked like? And so for me, integrating a specific race and class chapter was crucial, on top of weaving it in throughout the book for a couple of reasons. One of them being, I'm thinking of part of the audience here are my girlfriends. It's the Black women like me who feel like we've made it, but people are struggling to say that they are looking at an alternative system, because to them, capitalism means prosperity. Capitalism means, I've sacrificed all this, so why are you trying to take it away from me now, when we've been held back from really prospering, like as Black women, as Black people in this society. We should support Black-owned businesses. So this was a way to talk to my homegirls and say, okay, this is actually what capitalism means, and it doesn't mean that you can't live well. Socialism is about more people living well. It's about the masses living well. While capitalism does the opposite. It focuses a lot of the wealth and prosperity in the hands of a small few, a relatively small few. And if you look at the origins of capitalism, we would not have had it without, again, the enslavement of Black labor, the pillaging of the indigenous. The reasons why so many of the programs that we don't have right now have not prospered or lasted that long is because elected officials used race as a wedge. It was actually astonishing to me how much of the healthcare fight and the anti-healthcare fight throughout the entire 20th century was fear-mongering that communism on one hand and integration on the other would be combined with healthcare. And so if you actually give healthcare to everybody, including Black people, you would destroy the lives of white people, because at the time, eugenics was still a big issue. And so the rhetoric around it, the propaganda, the flyers, the brochures from the American Medical Association, the speeches that one of the chapter leaders was telling amongst his, fellow peers was that, this thing could keep Black people healthy, and we don't want to do that because that would threaten the white race. I learned so much more about the linkages between healthcare and some of these other issues, or even student loan debt. Again, as I mentioned, without that threat of integration, we probably, or people being upset about the threat of integration, we probably would still have cheap tuition today. So it's so integral in how capitalism has been able to survive.
And I should also say, in the context of student debt, Black women in particular have a really disproportionate share of that student debt, particularly from for-profit universities, that where people feel like they've bumped up against some type of glass ceiling without a degree, go and expend all this money to presumably further their career, and it really just ends up being just debt.